yes, we have Jack Gavigan. Please, a warm welcome for him.
Thank you. In order to explain where we are today, I thought it made sense to have a look at where we've come from. I'm sure that you're all aware that the UK banking market has had its share of issues over the years, not least of which is that it's incredibly concentrated amongst the top few banks. There's not a lot of movement between banks in terms of customers switching accounts. According to the 2015 figures, only 3% of customers had switched accounts within 2014. There traditionally was barriers to entry in terms of capital requirements, regulatory requirements, and also the presence of a very strong set of oligopolistic incumbents in a market where the price for their product was essentially zero. We've had free banking here in the UK for quite a while. The problem is that competition equals innovation, and therefore if you don't have competition, you're going to have no innovation. So we didn't have any banking APIs for retail customers or for SMEs. There are banking APIs for corporate customers. So if you're, people like RBS, Lloyds, they offer limited functionality through their APIs to their corporate customers. But as a result of that lack of competition, which led on to the lack of innovation, I think that the UK fintech leadership position was under threat. In Germany, they had free, open APIs that anybody could use, and that led to a kind of an explosion of banking apps coming out of Germany. In the US, they had more competition between banks. Although there's still quite a heavy concentration at the top, there's a lot more banks in general, and because it's a bigger market, the smaller banks are more viable. So we had apps like Simple emerging on the far side of the Atlantic, but nothing much here in the UK. And also, if you don't have investment in technology, then you're going to start having problems. And it ends up being a crappy experience for the customer. I wrote this, or designed this picture about 2.5 years ago, and it's been used as the inspiration for a few of the challenger banks that are being built now here in the UK. And the point of it is that the next generation bank is going to be built around APIs. We just heard about close coupled versus loose coupled. Few old banks are monolithic in their structure. The next generation of banks will be more loosely coupled. And in particular, I think that this concept of the marketplace, where banks will interface with an ecosystem to provide other suppliers with access to that bank's customers, I think that's a key part of where we're going to see banking going over the next few years. So back in 2014, the Treasury approached John Fingleton, who's an ex-regulator, an ex-competition regulator, who then set up his own consultancy after he left public service. And he, together with the Open Data Institute, put together a report on data sharing and open data for banks, published in 2014. And you can see that one of the key recommendations was that banks should agree on an open API standard. The following year, in the budget, the Chancellor announced a raft of measures that were supporting the fintech industry, looking at RegTech, opening up a sandbox, and also making it very clear that they were going to start pushing for seeing APIs in banking. So at this point, the writing's on the wall. It's pretty clear that something's going to be coming down the pipeline, but like everybody else, I was pretty skeptical of the government's ability to actually deliver something that would be worthwhile. In September 2015, the Open Banking Working Group was convened, and that group was convened by the Open Data Institute, which had previously worked with John Fingleton on his report. And what they did was they brought in over nearly 150 experts and people from across banks, the industry. And the way I got involved in it was through the Open Bank Project, who are, I think, co-hosting the event today. So, oh, hi, Ismail, how are you? So that was an interesting experience. You've got over 100 different people, different motivations. You've got the big banks there who are kind of wary about, well, what are we being asked to do here? You've got fintechs coming in, and they're eager to get banks to open up and give them access to their data. You've got industry schemes who are watching the world evolve around them and wondering where their position is going to be. And then you've got people like myself and Ishmael and Simon coming in with this kind of slightly radical open banking agenda, which a lot of people have difficulty grasping. There was a lot of, there was covered an awful lot of scope within that process from September through to December last year. Some of the key areas of focus that became, kind of a little bit not contentious, but required an awful lot of focus. The key one was liability. If a bank allows a third party to connect to its API, and then that third party screws up, and the customer's data is leaked or their money is gone, then who pays? At the moment, if the banks screw up, the banks pay. We, are able to use online banking here in the UK without fear of hackers getting in and taking our money, because the banks stand behind and they stand ready to compensate us if that happens. So they take the risk. But if you're going to ask banks to open up their APIs and allow third parties access, then you're taking control away from them, and it's perfectly reasonable for them to be nervous about that sort of situation, and to ask that there be appropriate measures put in place to make sure that those third parties aren't just fly-by-night operations who are going to abscond with everybody's money. There's the question of governments. If you're going to say that we're going to have a banking API, an open banking API here in the UK, but a bank doesn't want to adopt it, then what remedy do you have there? If a bank adopts an API but then hamstrings it a little bit, like Microsoft did with Java, how do you govern that situation? There's the carrots that we all are well aware of, which is why we're here today. That APIs can make our companies more agile, they can open up new streams of revenue, but sometimes there also needs to be a stick, because some of these organizations are stuck in the 1980s effectively. Security is a massive issue, not just around the technical security of the APIs themselves, but as I alluded to before, how do you make sure that the third parties that are actually connecting to those APIs on behalf of the end customer, are they doing the appropriate things to keep those people's data safe and to make sure that there's no inappropriate access to their accounts? And then data protection. So let's say I download my statement data, and last week I sent you a payment because we went skiing together and you paid for the flights. So your name is on my statement, and potentially even some details of your bank account. Is it appropriate for me to then share that with somebody else? So there are data protection issues that come into play there. Whilst all this was going on, and whilst we were merrily kind of thinking about APIs and so on, PSD2 was quietly bubbling along in the background, and then it suddenly popped up in November 2015. And I understand there was a talk earlier about PSD2. I assume that you're all well aware of it, but it's essentially looking at doing some of the same things that we in the Open Banking Working Group we're looking at. And there's this time clock ticking down to January 2018, when we're all supposed to be compliant, when the regulations are supposed to be transposed into national law. And even though the UK is going to be leaving the EU, this deadline is before we leave the EU. And even if it wasn't, I very, very strongly suspect that whatever deal we here in the UK end up negotiating with the EU will end up meaning that we conform to a lot of EU regulation anyway. So whether we like it or not, whether we wish it or not, PSD2 is coming down the line. So in 2016, the report was published. The recommendations, there's a nice thick report. The key recommendations were that an open banking standard should be overseen by an independent authority rather than by a group of the banks, for example. On the security side, we come up with the idea that third parties who want access to APIs should be vetted and whitelisted, so there should be security standards to make sure that they are appropriately able to protect the access that they're granted. And there's thought of requiring that they have insurance to be able to compensate customers in the event that they themselves ended up getting hacked. And John Fingleton, in his report the previous year, or back in 2014, had alluded to OAuth-style authentication, and that was something that we also recommended. And the idea there is that the banks maintain they maintain control of the authentication process, so they are able to ensure that the person who's connecting or who's authorizing this connection over the API is actually their customer. And it also means that in the event that the bank detects what they believe might be fraudulent behavior, they're able to shut down that connection and disconnect it. So that was a series of recommendations that we published. We handed it over to the Treasury, and then we heard absolutely nothing. And we thought initially that there was going to be an announcement in the budget, and the reason we were hearing nothing was because the budget quiet period had come along. But then we heard nothing in the budget. And then we heard nothing for several months afterwards. But there were conversations going on behind the scenes. The Treasury was having conversations with the banks about the content of the report. And as we later discovered, there were also conversations happening within the Competition and Markets Authority, who had been carrying on an investigation into the retail and SME market for banking services. In August, they, quite unexpectedly and quite pleasantly surprisingly, came out with a series of provisional recommendations requiring that the 9 largest banks in Great Britain and in Northern Ireland basically adopt the vast majority of the recommendations that we had put into the Open Banking Working Group's report. It was very, very pleasing to see that the work we had done hadn't just been filed away and ignored. I'm not sure how happy the banks were about it. I had heard some interesting conversations over beers at the end of the Open Banking Working Group about how banks were being expected to deal with too much regulation, how they were under the cosh. But I'm sure that everybody has their own opinion about how much sympathy the banks need in terms of dealing with regulation. The key recommendation that the Competition and Markets Authority came out with was that an independent body be set up and that it be chaired by a person known as the implementation trustee, who would be selected by the banks but approved by the Competition and Markets Authority. So, and also, and just to put some context around this, here on this slide you'll notice that it states whether it's an order or an undertaking, and this is an order, which means that the banks are obliged to follow it. They can't just say, yeah, we're going to do this, and then not. They actually have to do it. And they've set a deadline, which coincidentally happens to align with the PSD2 implementation. So that sets out the sort of background to where we are today, what's happening at the moment. Well, the Open Data Institute, who had convened the Open Banking Working Group, have formed an Open Banking Development Group. I haven't been involved in that. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there, or how many people have joined it, or what activity they're undertaking. The 9 banks who were named in the Competition and Markets Authority's order, they have formed an implementation entity steering group, and that's operating under the umbrella of Payments UK, which is one of the major industry bodies here in the UK. An advert went out for a very nicely paid job as an implementation trustee. I didn't apply, but I understand that a candidate has been selected and is expected to be announced in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, all of this is happening, but the challenger banks, people like Starling, people like Monzo, are forging ahead with their own systems, and it's likely that whilst they will launch with APIs that they've designed themselves, we're almost certain that they will adopt the new UK open banking API standard as and when it's defined and finalized. Meanwhile, the implementation entity steering group has been, about a month ago, they reached out to their stakeholders, and then they released some information online about what that structure is going to look like. And I love these pictures, you know. I kind of pride myself on making nice, pretty pictures that people want to photograph, but I think people want to photograph this one because there's so much information on it, and it's a little bit confusing. But essentially, you know, we're going to see an advisory group which will include representatives from fintech companies, customers, third parties. That will then interface with the steering group, overseen by the implementation trustee. And the whole idea is that to this timetable, they will eventually come out with an API around Q1 2018. I say around Q1 2018 because it's an aggressive plan, and it'll be interesting to see whether they actually manage to make it. But those processes are being spun up at the moment. So within the next few years, we can expect to start seeing certainly open data regarding banking products and pricing being released. And there's some other interesting provisions within the CMA's report and its orders around allowing SMEs to upload their transaction data to a site which will then do a search to figure out where they can get the best credit or cheapest credit. So there's a lot of information in what is an incredibly long report. I think it's something like 700 pages long. So I didn't read it all. I just did a search for APIs and read the relevant bits for me. But so that's where we stand today. I hope that gives a kind of a context of how we've got here, and a context for what's likely to happen over the next 18 months or so. And fingers crossed, in 2018, when we're having this conference, we'll have an open banking API here in the UK that anybody who fulfills those vetting and whitelisting criteria will be able to connect to. And that's it. Yeah. My objective was to get us back on time, so I think I've achieved that.
Thank you very much. So we owe you something.
Any questions?
Yeah. Any questions here? One here. Oh no, he's scratching.
Yeah, just a quick question as to how the implementation entity is formed by the CMA and the industry is going to interact with the ODI and the development group, the Open Banking Development Group. I mean, are you going to be interacting with each other or learning off each other, or how do you hope to influence what they output? So
I'm not actually involved in that, and I think they're spinning up and beginning to figure out what they need to do. They held a stakeholder day back on the 7th of September, and then they uploaded the slides to the website. They didn't publicize that stakeholder day very well. For example, I would have expected them to send an email to all the participants in the Open Banking Working Group. They didn't. I found out about it 2 weeks later, sort of thing. So, so I think they're, like all, large organizations, and particularly, a body that's made up of representatives from multiple large organizations. They're going to take a while to get up to speed. But hopefully the implementation trustee that they appoint will have enough energy or clout or gumption to force them to reach out and engage properly with as wide a group as possible. So yeah.
Thank you for this very interesting wrap-up of three last years. I'm Bruno Cambounet, and my question is, one of the key questions that happened within the organization that the CMA is pushing and their order to the 9 banks is, what about the fintech? I mean, the issue is that has been raised. I remember one of the meeting in Payment UK early September was about, but you know, if we are fintech, like you know, an account aggregator who is using usually the screen scraping methodology, you know, if this organization that you show is only managed by the 9 banks who are ordered to open their system, you know, what will guarantee kind of the fintech, like the aggregators, that we will get the information they are looking for into the APIs that these 9 banks will agreed upon? I think this is one of the big problem, you know, and what is your perspective on that?
I think the fact that the CMA were quite forceful in what they ordered, and the fact that they, you know, insisted that the implementation trustee be approved by them, the fact that they explicitly called out, you know, the different types of organizations, price comparison websites, by the way, is what PCW stands for, and then they use the terminology from PSD2. I'm generally optimistic. I mean, I think you have to be realistic about these things. You know, big organizations and big industries with vested interests are slow to adapt. I've been working in this industry since 2000, and I went into it from the dot-com world. So I was used to startups, agile, active, you know. And then, you know, I found myself working at Deutsche Bank, which is a huge organization. And since then, I've worked with a variety, both large and small. And, you know, the large organizations, they take time to adapt to new realities. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because we're talking about people's money and their savings here. So I think it's important to get it right. I think the technology often, you know, precedes regulation. Sometimes that's a good thing. It unlocks innovation, like it has with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. But in other times, if people are adopting new technologies and the governance hasn't been thought through, the security hasn't been thought through properly, and it's not just about the technology, it's also about the usability of it as well, then, you know, you can end up with unfortunate situations where people, through no fault of their own, end up being disadvantaged or, in a worst case scenario, defrauded. So I think that, you know, hopefully when the implementation trustee is named, it'll be someone that we can have confidence in. And you'll notice that specifically the CMA has ordered that the banks agree to be bound by the decisions of that trustee. So if the banks disagree, they can appeal to the trustee. The trustee disagrees with their appeal, then they're going to end up being bound. So this is very much a competition and regulatory driven thing, and this is the stick that's needed in order to make APIs, or at least an open banking API, a success here in the UK, in my opinion.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you very much.
Cool.